All right. So, welcome. Today we are going to talk our title is called Meet Locals in Your Server: How Local Accounts Can Cause Devastating Security Issues. We're going to go over just local servers, how they affect your environment, and the pros and cons of having them and what to do about them. So, I will hand it over to my wonderful co-host Rosie and let him get started.
Thank you, Katie. As always, thank you everyone for joining. And for the people that are listening to this afterwards, thanks again. We love doing this content for you. We love talking to people and sharing kind of the way that we think about some of the big issues as it relates to cybersecurity. And in today's topic, of course, as it relates to accounts, local accounts, whether those are server local accounts, database, LDAP, and all the other ways that people can get into your environment. So as always, I love to start these with a quote. And there's no more obvious quote than a quote from Pablo Picasso, of course, when we're talking about local accounts. But this is one of my favorite quotes. It's computers are useless. They can only give you answers. And the reason I picked this particular quote for today's topic is because when it comes to things like local accounts, whether it's database accounts, local server accounts, you really have to go looking for them. You have to ask questions. They will not just show up for you the way that, let's say, a directory account will show up, or an account that's in your HR system, or something that's in LDAP. Your main directory, your main source of accounts are always there, right? It's what you use to log in with. But to find these local accounts, you have to go, you have to ask questions. You have to discover them. You have to go looking for them. And that's what we're going to talk about today. So with that, let's talk about local accounts. What exactly are local accounts? Well, local accounts are accounts that live outside of the corporate directory. So in most instances, you'll be using Active Directory. LDAP could be your main directory. You could be using a third-party product like an Okta, for example, and that is your main directory. That is the main source of the accounts in the organization. Anything that lives outside of that main directory are what we call local accounts. So it isn't just local accounts on a server, even that is the title of this webinar, but it can be things like database accounts, Oracle, Sybase, SQL. They all have the ability to have local accounts within that platform. It could also be application accounts, accounts that live independent of a corporate directory, live inside of that application, and of course, Unix and Linux. So as we said, they can be operating system accounts, they could be application accounts, or they could be database accounts. In most instances, they are used for the management of these systems, and they're usually the accounts that get installed or created when those systems are set up. Not always, right? They could also be accounts that developers are creating or application owners are creating, or that applications actually need for the function of the application. But in many instances, they are accounts that are being created at the time that application, that platform, that operating system is set up. Well, who owns those accounts? Well, it's difficult to say who owns the accounts. In some instances, if we're talking about server local accounts, you can say, well, it should be the server team that owns these accounts, right? The problem is that it's not always the server team that needs those accounts or creates those accounts. It can be the application owner, and it can be a third-party application that simply requires a local account on the device, on the platform that it sits on or that it's managing. But ownership is a huge issue and something that we'll talk about a little bit later. And why are they a problem? Well, again, we'll go much deeper into why local accounts are a problem in terms of the decentralized nature of these accounts. But it is that decentralized nature that makes it difficult to enforce policies, which again makes them a huge security issue, and as a result, a huge problem. So let's talk about the different types of local accounts. We did say that, server, database, and application accounts. Within the server kind of bucket of these local accounts, you have Windows, of course, Linux, Unix, mainframe, but you also have to think about network devices. There could be local accounts on network devices, the accounts that you use to manage them, or again, those default accounts that get created whenever a device is stood up and for the most part ignored. IoT devices is yet another source of these local accounts that can exist, and in many instances, these accounts could be very privileged on these devices. So understanding that they exist, number one, finding them, right, discovering them is a big issue. But once you discover them, knowing the entitlements of these accounts on things like network devices, IoT devices, as well as mainframes and all the other platforms here from a server perspective is really critical. Database is another area that really we hear this all the time from our customers. They just have no visibility into these random Oracle Sybase accounts. Some accounts could have been created years ago from some platform or some application that required it, and potentially is no longer required. But without the ability to kind of quickly find these accounts and understand what they're being used for, understand the ownership, they linger and they linger, and the person that would do you harm will take advantage of that, right? Especially if that account is privileged, and especially if that account is privileged on a data set that has critical data, critical information about your customers or about your organization. And application accounts. Now, these again are accounts that exist as applications, and this is probably the most difficult one to track down, right? Because these accounts could live anywhere. They could live literally hard coded in DLLs. They could live in database tables. They could pretty much exist anywhere, and it's very, very difficult to track them down and figure out, well, what exactly are the entitlements of these applications, especially when you're dealing with applications that are internally developed that don't exist anywhere else but your organization. So what makes local accounts a problem? As we have been discussing, I'd like to say these accounts are hidden in plain sight. They're available for you to find. You could discover them, but you have to go looking for them. Again, it goes back to what our friend Pablo Picasso said, right? The computers don't ask questions. Local accounts do not make themselves visible unless you go looking for them. You have to discover them. And if you've listened to some of our previous webinars and our podcasts, we talked about discovery. We talked about the challenges with discovery and finding these accounts. And when we talk about them being hidden in plain sight, is that when you go looking for them, you will find them. You will absolutely find them, right? But you have to go looking. And that's the key challenge, one of the key challenges of local accounts. Again, they exist outside the corporate directory. They're not going to be your AD accounts or your LDAP accounts or the accounts where when you ask most of the people in your IT organization, well, what's the source of the accounts in your organization? They might say, oh, AD is our authoritative source, or LDAP is our authoritative source. So they might say Okta is our authoritative source. But no one really thinks about those extra accounts, right? They think about those accounts when they have to think about locking down the endpoints. Here's another challenge. A lot of times these accounts are being used as services for applications. I talked about the example where you could have some legacy application that required a local account, right? And this could be an account that potentially isn't being used, but it still has access to that environment. It still has access to that application. It's still something you need to discover and you need to mediate. And I like to say that they are extremely distributed. In fact, they are the definition of distribution, right? They don't live in a central directory. They live in each individual server, each individual application, each individual database. So they are distributed. But that distribution is a negative, not a positive. We usually talk about distributed platforms, distributed environments as a good thing, right? The ability to handle large, wide-scale environments. But here, that distribution is actually a bad thing because it makes it very, very difficult to manage. And of course, when it makes it difficult to manage, it means it's difficult to enforce policies. Password policies, policies for whether or not the accounts should exist, the entitlements that these accounts should have, who should own them, becomes very difficult because of the distributed nature of these accounts. So how do we fix the problem? Well, so just like anything else, and we've talked about this in previous webinars, you have to first discover them, right? Again, they're hidden in plain sight, but they are in plain sight. So you can find them. You have to find them. And you have to then analyze, okay, well, should these accounts exist or not? And are they a problem? Do I need to get rid of them and replace them with an AD account, for example? And then finally, you have to actually fix it. Except there's a few steps that we're missing here, right? Because we've talked about this in some of the previous webinars and in the podcasts. You can't just go from discovery to analysis without understanding, well, what are these accounts actually being used for? To answer the question of should these accounts exist, is there an issue with this account? You have to understand the account type. You have to understand which ones are being used as services, which ones are admin accounts, which ones are regular user accounts, potentially, or personal accounts. You have to understand those different account types so that you could then overlay the controls and violations to understand whether or not these accounts, number one, should exist, but more importantly, do they have the entitlements that they should have? Are they being used in a way that they absolutely should not be used? Do we have a local account that is a developer's personal account, but it's being used to run a service? That's a bad thing, right? That needs to be addressed. But again, even when you've discovered everything that's wrong, you cannot go directly to remediate. You have to shift the operational risk, and we've talked about this in previous webinars, that shift of the operational risk, not to the security person, infrastructure person that is actually making the change, but the application owner, the person who understands exactly what this account is, what it does, why it exists, and understands the ramifications of the remediation you're proposing. For example, taking a local account, converting it to an AD account. You need to find an owner of that account, someone who understands exactly what that account is being used for and exactly what you're doing or what you'd like to do, understands what you're doing, why you're doing it, approves it. And that approval process is key, right? Because they understand it. As an infrastructure person, as a security person, you cannot be expected to understand how every application works. You simply can't. It's not that you want to shift the responsibility. You're not authorized to make that decision. You are not authorized to make a decision about an application account that could take down a critical and making a change to that application account that could take down a critical application. You're simply not authorized to make that decision. So this is why we talk about shifting the operational risk. It's not about, pointing a finger to someone else. It's about you're just not qualified. You should not have that responsibility. So ownership is always, always the key to pretty much everything. And then finally, remediate. Then you can finally fix the issues. But of course, this is never a one-time thing. You have to repeat this over and over again. Local accounts, whether they are application accounts, database accounts, server accounts, they're constantly being created. New servers are being built every day. New platforms, new applications are bought every day. So this isn't something that you could do as a one-time activity. You have to constantly rescan, rediscover. You have to constantly ask questions. As Picasso said, ask questions. Do you exist? What are you doing? Who owns you, right? And can we remediate this? And should this account exist or not? And ideally, you shouldn't have any local accounts. But the reality is it's virtually impossible to have no local accounts. So remediation, let's talk about actually fixing the issue. What are some of the challenges with remediation? Well, developers are people too. I like to remind people that developers are just regular human beings, that sometimes they make mistakes and sometimes they take shortcuts and sometimes they do things that they shouldn't do, like using local accounts when they should be using domain accounts, like using personal accounts to run services and schedule tasks, when they are under the pressure of a deadline, when there's an outage, when there are things that are not working and they're under extreme pressure to get it working, they might make decisions that cause this issue, right? And then the problem is that once this issue exists, the longer that issue lives in your environment, the harder it is to get rid of it, because some of the people that made that decision might leave, or there could be something where people simply forget, and you go ask a developer, why are you using this local account? And the answer comes back with, I just don't know. And then you ask the next question, well, can I get rid of it? And the answer is, I don't know, right? So you do have to work with developers, and you have to understand that they're not doing this simply because of laziness. Sometimes there's other external pressures that cause accounts to exist and to be created. And related to that is the concept or the idea of legacy applications always get in the way, right? That one application, it's been around for years, No one knows who originally wrote it. The person is long gone, and there's no idea if the application exists inside of a DLL, or if the credentials are buried somewhere in the executable or in a database table. It's just simply impossible to know without someone taking the time to kind of dig through the source code if it is an internally developed application, and figuring it out. And ownership. We always talk about ownership. We had a webinar dedicated to ownership. It's hard. It's hard to find the owners of these accounts that are not in a central repository, that are probably not in your CMDB, that are probably don't have a lot of metadata about them. Finding the ownership of these accounts so that you can take the remediation action is difficult. And then finally, again, ask a lot of questions. You will get a lot of answers. Look for these hidden accounts. Look for these accounts in plain sight, and you will find them. The problem is you will find a lot of them. And then when you overlay the account type and you overlay the controls, you will get a lot of violations. So having that understanding of what do I focus on? Where is there something that is a real security issue versus just information? That's another big challenge of going from that discovery, from the asking questions to ultimately figuring it out. So as always, in these webinars, how does Fearboard do it? Well, we talk about our identity hygiene platform and the offerings around those platforms, and we've talked about different engines in the webinar, the past webinars, as well as essentially some of our podcasts. And ultimately, our goal is discover and remediate. But let's talk about the individual engines and how they help solve this problem with local accounts. So the first thing is discovery. Of course, this is the ask questions, right? This is where we ask database platforms and we ask all of the servers, do you have any local accounts? Our connectors are how we reach out to these devices, these platforms, and say, are there any local accounts on these platforms that we need to have a full inventory over? And of course, through our scheduler, this is not a one-time activity. It is something that we have to constantly collect, constantly refresh. Next is we talked about kind of going from that initial discovery to then overlaying the controls. You have to have an understanding of what these accounts are being used for. You have to understand which ones are service accounts, which ones are admin accounts, which ones are regular user accounts. That's critical to then apply that control framework to figure out, well, what do I actually have to fix? And we talked about the account type rules engine in depth in some of the previous webinars. Next, you have to look at, and one of the main reasons why you defined those account types is to overlay and apply the controls, right? And as a result, get the violations, the things that need to be fixed. Now, when it comes to local accounts, they could be very simple. You simply don't want any local accounts, period, right? So the control is if the local account exists, it must not exist, right? And then you have to deal with those exceptions. You have to deal with all the things that come up with actually doing the remediation, where maybe the development team needs a few months, a few weeks to remediate. That the account type discover allows you to discover exactly what needs to be fixed with these particular local accounts. Even if they do have to exist, you do want to apply some layer controls, right? You do want to make sure that the passwords are being rotated, that they're onboarded into a vaulting solution such as CyberArk. So you want to overlay those controls along with the asset type to tell you exactly where the issues are that need to be addressed. Then we talk about ownership. Okay, great. We found everything. Ownership, as we've said in the past, is the bridge between discovery, asking questions, and remediation, actually resolving the problem, and that operational risk. So our account type rules engine, our ownership automation tool allows you to set up what we call methods that allows you to find good proposed owners for these accounts. Again, local accounts, especially local accounts, are very, very difficult to track down an owner, right? You don't have the benefit of a central directory where you might have some controls over exactly how the metadata is populated for those directory accounts, things like description fields being populated or leveraging OUs. And of course, there could be issues with that as well. But specifically with local accounts, it's very, very challenging, especially when there isn't some predefined naming convention or some other piece of metadata. What we've done, however, is we've developed some really sophisticated algorithms that go out and find a good starting point. And what we find, as we've said in the past, is that even if we don't get the exact owner, we are within the sphere of ownership of that person. And usually we come close enough where they know who the owner is. And then through crowdsourcing, which we'll talk about in a second, is how they reassign ownership. And then ultimately we get to the, and that's exactly what our ARM platform is. We're going to have some future webinars where we do a much deeper dive into our ARM tool as well as the virtual workers, the thing that actually resolves the issue. But once you find that good proposed owner, you need a human being to confirm, number one, say, yes, I am the owner. I confirm that I am the owner of this, or reassign ownership. And then you're going to ask them very specific questions about what you want to do. Maybe you want to get rid of that local account and replace it with a domain account. Maybe you need to enforce a password policy. Maybe you need to onboard this account into CyberArk, for example. Well, ARM is the tool with which we reach out to these individuals, and then they interact with the tools to give those responses so that they're all in one central repository. And then once we receive those responses, we schedule our virtual worker that goes out and actually makes the change, commits the solves the problem, converts that account, sets the password policy, onboards it into the correct vaulting solution, moves it to the correct OU if we're talking about a domain account, and replacing that local account with a domain account. And as we said, this is not a one-time activity. It's an activity that you're going to have to do over and over and over again. Except what could happen is, while you're busy solving these issues, closing these violations, someone could be equally busy creating new ones. So what we do with our stock and flow reporting is we are able to show you progress over time. We're able to show you that what you're doing is working. We are solving issues, right? You have a set number of violations, and the stock that you started with is going down. But if new flow issues are being created, maybe you have a bad build and new local accounts are being created every time a new Linux device is created or built, or a Windows device is built, we pick that up as flow. And what we allow you to do is dig into why those got created, figure out where there's a broken process. Maybe it's a bad build, maybe it's a training issue, fix it at its source so that you stay at zero when it comes to continually monitoring your environment, continually asking questions, right? It all comes back to asking questions and saying, do you exist? So just to review, and we kind of do this at the end of every webinar to kind of talk about the different engines and what we've reviewed so far, and how everything ties together. So we have talked about discovery, right? All throughout this webinar, I've been talking about the idea of asking questions, finding those hidden in plain sight accounts. We talked about defining the different account types, right? So that you can get to ultimately get to the controls that have to be applied. And then, of course, ownership. And we touched a little bit on campaigning and remediation, but as I said, we will have a much, much deeper dive into exactly how campaigning works, exactly how remediation works in future podcasts. But it's difficult to talk about local accounts without talking about the remediation, right? Discovery for the sake of discovery, reporting for the sake of reporting is really just reporting for the sake of reporting. Ultimately, the whole reason that we do this is to reduce risk and solve problems. And when we talk about local accounts, again, this spans all of these steps, as many other assets and concepts that we talk about, whether in the webinar or when we talk to customers. Again, the whole idea is that discovery isn't enough, analyzing isn't enough, ownership isn't enough. The whole reason that we do this is to get to that remediation state. We ask the right questions because we need to get to that answer. And then sometimes that answer is we need to that account shouldn't exist. Sometimes it's onboarding the account. But ultimately, the answer to all of these questions is, how do we get to risk reduction? That's the whole reason we do any of this, is for risk reduction. And all the engines that make up the identity platform take you from asking a simple question, do I have local accounts, to getting to the answer of, I do. I've either gotten rid of them or I put in the controls so that I can properly manage them. With that, are there any questions? One question is, Are the security account CyberArk PAM data separate modules within the Sphereboard platform? Very good questions. Our CyberArk PAM module actually includes accounts and security. When you purchase Sphereboard for CyberArk PAM, which is meant for Sphereboard customers, it does include everything that the accounts module does, as well as the CyberArk functionality. The accounts module really is meant for non-CyberArk customers. But when you purchase the CyberArk Sphereboard for CyberArk PAM module, it does include security. So we always include security because you really can't properly talk about accounts or even onboarding accounts into a vaulting solution without having a full understanding of AD and group membership information and all of the nested membership information. So security is absolutely included in that. The only thing that's separate from that is our data module, which is really more about understanding your unstructured data, the permissions of the unstructured data. So that's really the only platform that's separate. Sphereboard for CyberArk PAM essentially gives you everything up to data. Any other questions? Sphereboard have the ability to write back to AD users group objects, such as if the account owner changes and the new owner is collected. Absolutely. So our virtual worker does exactly that. So it can do things like update the manage by field for groups or accounts, as an example. It could do other things like move accounts into different OUs, move groups into different OUs. It could change the mail to attributes. It could change the group membership information. It can flatten groups. There's quite a lot that we could do with Active Directory, with the virtual worker and Active Directory. But that use case that the person asking the question is asking about is actually a really, really good use case that a lot of customers do. They want AD to be the definitive source of ownership of AD objects. So they will do an ARM campaign to confirm ownership. And once we get that confirmed owner, we push that back to the manage by field for those objects.
On June 10th to June 12th, we have our annual 360 Summit. And this is an opportunity for leaders that are currently working in cybersecurity to get together, to network, to meet other cybersecurity leaders. We have Maureen Allison from Johnson & Johnson, Keith Anderson from JetBlue, Brand from CyberArk, and a bunch of other leaders will be joining. So if you guys are working in cybersecurity leadership currently and would like to join us, I'll drop the link in the chat. It is in Nashville, and your room is actually covered by Sphere. We'll be staying at the Gaylord Opryland Resort and Convention Center. We don't cover travel, but we do cover your room, so that will be taken care of. We've got a bunch of good speakers. We have a bunch of good topics, and you'll also get some key insight into some of the things that are happening with Sphereboard. Whether you know a lot about Sphereboard now, you're currently learning about Sphereboard, you'll get firsthand insight into the newest stuff that we're going to be releasing. I've dropped the link below. There's more information on the page. Please feel free to look through it. And if this is something that you'd like to join, you can register and you can actually book your room right after registration. Our topic for next month is a surprise because we are actually going to be live from our 360 Summit. So you will get to either be there in person or you can tune in and see us talk about everything there firsthand. If you have any additional questions, please feel free to reach out to us. We'll see you guys next month. All right. Bye.